We all know family drama can get a little heated sometimes, but this story, this story takes it to a whole other level. We're diving into a case from Kerala, India. 23-year-old Afan murdered 6 members of his own family with a hammer. It's just brutal.
The details of this case are truly disturbing. Multiple blows, smashed faces. It really does paint a picture of just uncontrolled rage.
Yeah.
What's especially chilling is that after the murders, Afan walked right into the police station and calmly confessed. There's a sense of detachment there from the reality of his actions that's just really unsettling.
Yeah, it's really hard to imagine what kind of mindset leads someone to do something like this. So let's try to understand what happened that day. Afan's first victim was his girlfriend, Farsana. She was a postgraduate student. And she was found seated, her face unrecognizable from the repeated hammer blows.
This case really forces us to think about the psychology of extreme violence. Like, what could drive someone to such an act? Was this a crime of passion, a premeditated act, or something else entirely? And how might substance abuse or mental health have played a role? We know the police have stated that Fun was a drug user, but without knowing the specifics, it's difficult to speculate about the impact that might have had.
Right, and it's important to remember that substance abuse is a complex issue. Different drugs can affect the brain in very different ways, and those effects can vary dramatically from person to person.
Exactly. Some drugs can trigger paranoia, hallucinations, even violent outbursts. They can also impair judgment, impulse control, even the ability to distinguish right from wrong.
Yeah.
But we need to be careful about drawing direct lines between drug use and violent behavior. It's never that simple.
So let's look at the other victims in this case. Afan's 13-year-old brother, Absan, was also killed with multiple blows to the head. But there's a really strange detail here. Police found 500 rupee notes scattered around his body. What could that possibly mean?
That detail is particularly intriguing. It's hard to say for sure what it signifies, but it raises some interesting questions. Could it be a symbolic act, a bizarre attempt at remorse or restitution? Or perhaps a sign of disassociation, a disconnect from the reality of what he'd done?
And then there's the sheer brutality inflicted on his uncle, Lathif. His skull was hit at least 20 times. It's hard to comprehend that level of rage.
This kind of overkill suggests a level of fury that goes beyond simply wanting to kill. It could point to a deep-seated resentment, a need to completely obliterate the victim, perhaps even erase them from his own memory.
And Afan's aunt, Sujitha, was attacked from behind while making tea. It's almost as if she was targeted for simply being kind to him.
It's a chilling detail that adds to the unsettling nature of this case. It raises questions about Effen's relationships with his family members. Were there simmering tensions or past conflicts that might have contributed to his actions?
It's almost impossible to wrap your head around the fact that these were his own family members. You have to wonder what kind of environment could foster such hatred.
It's important to remember that we're dealing with a complex individual here. We can't simply label him as evil or psychotic. There are likely many contributing factors, psychological, social, perhaps even biological, that led to this horrific act.
So we have this puzzle with a lot of missing pieces. Possible drug use, the potential for underlying mental health issues, and this whole question of motive. What does this all mean? Where do we go from here?
I think the key is to try to understand Afan as a person, as flawed and disturbed as he may be. What were his experiences, his struggles, his relationships? By delving into those details, we might be able to piece together a more complete picture of what led to this tragedy.
That's a great point. And it brings us to the surviving members of this family. Ofan's mother, Shemi, was also attacked, but thankfully survived. And his 88-year-old grandmother, Salma Bibi, was targeted as well. Can you imagine the trauma they've endured?
It's heartbreaking to think about what they've been through, and it underscores the ripple effect of such violence, how it impacts not only the immediate victims, but also their loved ones, who are left to grapple with the aftermath.
And as if the hammer attacks weren't horrifying enough, there's this added layer of attempted arson. Afan tried to cause a gas explosion by leaving the LPG valve open. What do you make of that?
That's a significant detail that shouldn't be overlooked. It suggests that Afan's intentions went beyond simply harming his family. The attempted explosion hints at a desire to obliterate, to erase, perhaps even a suicidal impulse. It adds a whole other dimension of self-destruction to this already horrific narrative.
Yeah, it's just mind-boggling. And then there's the added layer of tragedy for Afan's father, Rahim. He's stuck in Saudi Arabia because of visa issues. Can you imagine getting that phone call that your son has committed these unimaginable acts and you can't even be there to support your surviving family members?
It's a layer of helplessness and despair that's hard to fathom. It really highlights the ripple effects of a tragedy like this. The impact extends far beyond the immediate victims, reaching out to touch the lives of everyone connected to them.
So we've got this incredibly brutal crime. A perpetrator who seems to have been in a completely detached state of mind, and a family utterly shattered. But the most pressing question remains, why? What could possibly drive someone to such extremes?
That's the question that haunts every case like this. It's easy to write someone like Afan off as a monster, but the reality is far more complex. There are likely multiple factors at play here. We've already touched on the potential roles of drugs and mental illness, but there are also social and environmental factors that could be relevant. Were there stressors in Afan's life? Financial troubles, relationship problems? We may never have a complete answer, but it's important to consider all possibilities.
Earlier, we talked about how different drugs can have different effects on the brain. Can you elaborate on that a little? How might a specific substance relate to the type of violence we see in this case?
Of course. While it's irresponsible to speculate on the specific substances Afan may have used without more information, we can talk generally about how certain drugs can impact behavior. For instance, stimulants like methamphetamine can increase agitation, paranoia, and aggression. Hallucinogens can distort perceptions of reality, leading to unpredictable and sometimes violent actions. And even depressants like alcohol, when consumed in excess, can lower inhibitions and lead to impulsive acts.
So while drug use alone doesn't automatically equate to violence, it can certainly create a volatile situation, especially when combined with other factors like mental illness or a history of aggression.
Exactly. It's all about understanding the interplay of these different factors. It's like a recipe for disaster. You might have all the ingredients for a terrible outcome, but it takes a certain combination and a triggering event to set it all in motion.
Okay, so drugs are a potential piece of the puzzle. But what about mental health? Could there be underlying psychological conditions that contributed to Afan's outburst? Could this have been prevented?
It's certainly possible. There are several mental health conditions that can lead to aggressive or violent behavior, especially when left untreated. For example, someone with antisocial personality disorder might lack empathy and have a disregard for social norms, making them more prone to violence. Severe depression can also manifest as anger and aggression in some cases. And of course, trauma, especially unresolved childhood trauma, can have a profound impact on behavior, sometimes leading to violent outbursts later in life.
So if a fan was struggling with a mental health condition, would there have been warning signs that someone could have noticed?
There are often warning signs, but they can be subtle and easily missed. Changes in behavior, increased isolation, expressions of anger or resentment. These can all be red flags. The challenge is recognizing those signs and knowing how to respond.
Yeah, it's easy to look back in hindsight and say someone should have intervened. But the reality is that these situations are complex, and it's not always clear when someone is at risk of committing violence.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that mental illness is not a direct cause of violence. The vast majority of people with mental health conditions are not violent, but it's a risk factor that we need to be aware of, just like substance abuse or a history of violent behavior.
So we're left with a lot of unanswered questions about Athan's state of mind, his motivations, and the events leading up to that day. But what about the bigger picture here? What can we learn from a case like this?
I think one of the most important takeaways is that we need to be having more open and honest conversations about mental health and substance abuse. These issues are often stigmatized, and people are afraid to reach out for help.
Right. We tend to shy away from these uncomfortable conversations. But the reality is that mental health affects everyone. It's not something that should be whispered about behind closed doors. It's something we need to talk about openly and honestly so that people who are struggling can feel comfortable seeking help.
Exactly, and we need to do a better job of educating ourselves about the warning signs of potential violence, not just in others, but in ourselves as well.
Yeah.
Do we recognize when we're feeling overwhelmed or stressed? Do we have healthy coping mechanisms? Do we know how to reach out for support when we need it?
Yeah. These are important questions for all of us to consider. And I think it's crucial to remember that this isn't just about individual responsibility. It's also about creating a society where people feel supported, where there are resources available, and where seeking help isn't seen as a sign of weakness, but as a sign of strength. This whole conversation has been pretty heavy, and I imagine our listener might be feeling a bit overwhelmed right now. Is there anything you'd like to leave them with, something to help them process all of this?
Well, I think it's important to remember that even in the face of such darkness, there's always hope. We can learn from these tragedies. We can use them as a catalyst for change by raising awareness, advocating for better resources, and supporting one another. We can create a world where these kinds of horrific events become less frequent, a world where people feel empowered to seek help before it's too late.
Those are powerful words to end on. This deep dive into the Carola Hammer horror case has been a sobering reminder of the complexities of human behavior, the devastating consequences of violence, and the urgent need for a more proactive and compassionate approach to mental health and substance abuse.
If this deep dive has sparked your interest in learning more, I encourage you to explore the resources available in your own community. Support organizations that are working to combat these issues. Engage in conversations with your loved ones. And remember, even small acts of kindness and understanding can have a ripple effect, contributing to a safer and more empathetic world for all of us.
That's a great call to action. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder these questions and continue the conversation in your own circles. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.